pool room at the moment, or at least that's your background.
And we
Good
are live,
afternoon.
senators.
Good afternoon.
So, good afternoon, everybody. This is the Vermont State Senate Committee on Institutions. Today is February 18th, 2022. I am Joe Benning, the chair of the committee. Going across my screen to introduce everybody else, we have Senator Mazza from Colchester Grand Isle, Senator McCormick from Windsor, Senator Ingalls from Essex Orleans, Senator Parent from St. Albans, Franklin County. I wasn't sure which one to give you proper designation first.
Yeah.
I have spent a lot of time on this committee introducing folks and talking about the fact that we have a YouTube audience. And Secretary French, I'm going to give you the opportunity to come aboard and join us in a moment, and ask that when you begin, you give us a little rendition of who you are and how you came into the position, and certainly to tell us what that background is you have on you, because this committee really likes history, and you're not sitting in a modern classroom by any stretch. But I'd like to take the opportunity for our YouTube audience for a moment and give a little bit of an explanation about the legislative process. We have, as legislators, something called a point of personal privilege. And the point of personal privilege gives us an opportunity to maybe say something nice about our families or whatever the case may be, and on occasion to give an explanation or some kind of a response to something that may have happened in our lives. And in this particular situation, I'm going to personally apologize for a remark that I had made on Wednesday when Eric Filkhorn, one of the beloved members of this group of people who meets on a regular basis, popped on the screen, and I made a very awkward comment at best, and at worst, a very insensitive comment, and I very much regret that. The point of this is to do a little bit of humility and to let people know that it's okay once in a while to do some self-searching and make sure that you live up to your expectations. I certainly feel like I did not, and I apologize to all the members of the committee. And just for the YouTube audience, I apologize to each of the folks who are on your screen today, personally, via phone call. And I thought it was appropriate that since we are live on YouTube, I should also apologize to the YouTube audience. Any comments, thoughts as we head into our afternoon conversation? I don't
Go
see
forth
anybody.
and sin no more, Mr. Chair.
I plan on it. Thank you very much, folks. Secretary French, sorry for the rather awkward beginning, but it had to be said. I'd like to welcome you to Senate Institutions this afternoon.
Thank you.
I understand we're going to be talking about Section 6 of the Capitol Bill, Emergency Aid for School Construction. And it's been a while since we have seen you. I'd like to get an update of sorts as to how things are going as well. And at any point in time, if you want us to call up Section 6 of the spreadsheet from the Capitol Bill, we'll be happy to do that. And if there's anything else you'd like to have on the screen to screen share, our committee assistant, Alex, will help you out with that. So welcome.
Thank you, Dan French, Secretary of Education. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. My headphones are working a little weird. Yeah, by way of introduction, I've been secretary since 2018. I began my career teaching in a classroom very similar to the one behind me in Colebrook, New Hampshire. After getting out of the Army, my wife and I, my wife's a teacher as well. That was one of the few places I could find a job as a social studies teacher. It was hard to find a teaching job back then. I was one of 125 applicants for a position in northern New Hampshire. At the time, we were living near Lake Winnipesaukee in central New Hampshire. And we really enjoyed living up there. I eventually went to school to get my master's in school administration and became my first principal job was at Canaan right across the river in Colebrook. So I've lived in the Canaan, Vermont area up in the kingdom for about 15 years, as principal at Canaan School for 7 years. And then I was superintendent there of the Essex North Supervisory Union for 3 years. And eventually moved on opportunity to take a bigger job originally from Connecticut. So I became superintendent of the Bennington Rutland Supervisory Union, which is fairly large supervisory union centered more or less in the Manchester, Vermont area in southwestern Vermont. It's where I still live today. Was superintendent there for 9 years. Was president of the Superintendents Association, superintendent of the year 2009. And in 2016, I decided to try other things. Was more or less recruited to go to St. Michael's College, where I ran the school leadership program, the graduate program there for aspiring school leaders. Did that for a couple of years. During that time, I also did a lot of consulting. This was when Act 46 was coming out, so I was doing a lot of consulting, a lot about organizational change related to merger. And it's from there in 2018 that Governor Scott appointed me as secretary. And I certainly thought in 2018 that some of the more challenging things I'd ever do as a secretary was going to be Act 46. As you know, that law in many ways, the last time we tried something like that was in the late 1880s, what were affectionately called the Vicious Acts. But certainly I think the pandemic has exceeded my expectations in that regard. It's been a very challenging moment, but also honestly quite rewarding to work as part of a really talented team and see how Vermont has addressed one of the most challenging moments in our history, frankly. And so that work's ongoing. We've had the first year of the pandemic, we had to shut down the entire school system virtually overnight, shift everyone to remote learning. We opened that first year in the fall with eventually over 200 pages of detailed guidance on how to operate our schools. This was before vaccination was available and testing and so forth. And then as we got further into the school year, when vaccination became available, we thought we were at the light of the end of the tunnel as we ended the school year last year. And certainly we're anticipating this fall to be more or less back to normal, quote unquote. And then the virus threw us yet another curve in the form of the Delta variant and then the Omicron variant. So we've been working through those moments, largely adjusting our mitigation posture on testing, starting out with a pretty intensive process around contact tracing and what was called test to stay. And then Omicron further challenged us in that regard logistically, and we had to shift to what we call test at home, sort of abandoning contact tracing because it was too slow to keep up with the pace of the virus. And now we're coming out the other end of Omicron, and like many other parts of the world and the country, we're anticipating moving to more of an endemic, I call it acceptance, if you will, of living with the virus. And that's sort of the moment we're in right now as we enter into school vacations. Most of our schools are on vacation this coming week. We've been, certainly the issue of masking gets a lot of coverage, but I think that's symbolic of kind of where people are at in terms of thinking both personally and collectively what we perceive as the risks from the virus, because I think that's been the other story as we've been working through sort of the logistical up and downs of navigating mitigation of the virus. The risks to us from the virus have been going down steadily as a result of vaccination and certainly some of the treatments that we have now available. So we're in a pretty good moment right now relative to mitigation, but it has been exceedingly challenging for our students, their families, and our school staff to navigate. And now we're poised to what we call enter a recovery phase, where we want to focus on issues of learning loss, mental health, and so forth. And that work will be ongoing for the next several years, I expect. So any questions on that? The introductory piece? I don't have a specific location for this picture. It's one I picked off the web, but it looks a lot like Colebrook Academy, where I used to teach.
Well, it would probably score you more points if you went to Granby and got inside that building, and took a picture, but I was very impressed with your background. I have one kind of off-topic question. I know that the school districts were authorized to make their own positions on mask mandates, and I know that things have been changing constantly. Is there a shift in the districts being able to make their own decisions as long as they meet with state expectations now?
Yeah, it's fair to say we've relied on the local authority of school districts in the second year of the pandemic. And the first year under the state of emergency, I should have said that when we were promulgating like 200 pages of guidance, that was under the specific emergency authority of the governor. And as secretary, I was delegated specific authority that allowed me and required me to promulgate guidance that essentially had the force of regulation on the school districts. Absent a state of emergency, we've been really at the state level providing recommendations for schools and working through their authority. School boards in particular have an authority under the law to ensure the safety of their schools, and that sort of broad authority is what we've been utilizing to enact mitigation recommendations. And the school boards have basically been requiring mitigation steps like masking under our recommendation at the state level. And I think most folks are familiar, that's worked out pretty well. We had one school, coincidentally, my old school, Canaan School, choose not to require masking, but that was enacted otherwise universally across the state. So very similar pattern now. Everything we're doing is in the form of a recommendation because we don't have that additional authority, and nor do we think it's needed. What we're trying to do now is really, I think, I call it an acceptance phase in terms of moving towards that endemic. And we found in the first year of the pandemic, coming out of the mitigation steps is almost as difficult or more difficult than going into them. So convincing people they can let go of certain things. And we've been highlighting some of the mitigation strategies that schools have enacted that are above and beyond anything we would recommend at the state level. For example, students wearing masks on the playground outside and so forth. We've long since, and our infectious disease doctors have long since been recommending that there's no mitigation necessary for outside activities. So we have some work to do essentially for people to accept those conditions and make that progress. And it's largely a communications exercise, working with superintendents and school boards and staff. A lot of stakeholder engagement. Usually on Thursdays and Fridays, I have state level meetings with all the stakeholder groups. I'm about to have one this afternoon. The teachers union and so forth, all the other associations will be present. So we've benefited from having those close, regular contacts so we can work on issues of messaging when we get into these transition moments. And this is a big transition moment with no doubt the recommendation to remove masks is going to come off. But more importantly, we have to shift the system, the education system, to be back fully in the education business as opposed to being partially in the public health business. And that's kind of sort of the goal. Right now, we have probably 30% of the school day, just to pick a percentage of the year, is caught up in implementing mitigation recommendations. So we need 100% of our work inside schools to be back on education, and that's going to require sort of making this transition. So we're still leveraging the local decision making. It's particularly if you want to focus on masks as sort of a symbol of that. I expect there will be. I already know there are districts that are moving forward now with removing their masks as making them optional. Many of them are enacting that the first week of March after the vacation. There will be others, no doubt, that require masks inside their schools beyond a date when we recommend they can come off. But I think, as we found previously with putting masks on, the majority will probably follow the lead of the state recommendations.
I'll have to say, in hindsight, looking back, I am quite sure you have received flack from virtually every corner along the way. And considering statewide the student population, I think you guys have done an admirable job of trying to keep things together under the onslaught of communications I'm sure you're getting from all quarters. So I appreciate that update. It's a little off topic, I understand. I don't know if anybody has any questions so far about that subject. Senator Mazza?
I don't know if it's this subject, Mr. Chair, but I'm curious about the many years that some of us have served in this committee. The state aid for capital improvements through schools throughout Vermont was every year was millions of dollars. And that's stopped a few years ago. And I wonder what impact that's having in the future of our schools, because there's been no money from the state at all. How are they handling the update to the schools, or airflows, or construction expansion, or whatever? Is that an issue, or is that something that's being resolved through its own folks?
Yeah, it's a great question, Senator. It is a big issue. We had the moratorium on school construction aid in 2007.
Right.
And we never covered, I'll call it maintenance issues with the school construction. If you just think of traditional school construction as putting an addition on or building a new school, maintenance issues were always a function of school district budgets. And in the law, school boards are required to maintain their schoolhouses. But what's happened certainly, I think, with a moratorium on school construction aid is there's been a general moratorium or deference or deferring, I should say, not deference, deferring of maintenance issues as well. So we have this phenomena since 2007 where some of the maintenance issues have been deferred and now are accumulated to the point where there's an increased need for construction. We have also this unique moment in time in terms of the federal dollars coming into the state relative to the pandemic, which coincidentally can be used for school facilities issues. So we're trying to leverage the moment, if you will, the money that we have coming in now to really sort of catch up on some of the issues that have been accumulating. That sort of dynamic between the things we've accumulated versus addressing the moment and planning for the future is captured in a policy initiative that the General Assembly approved last year, Act 72. So we have very specific strategies relative to improving the planning, the regulation, also trying to encourage and support schools moving forward with addressing HVAC issues and other issues that are related to the pandemic, but also contribute to improvements in facilities. So there's a lot of work going on right now. It's kind of a strange moment because we have a policy in place that's helping us make some progress on the moratorium issue. We have a lot of money coming in, but now we have this issue of workforce shortages. So increasingly the backlog on making progress is the lack of mechanical contractors or construction supervisors that can be available to do the work. And there's probably only 3 good months out of the year when you can get some work done in schools anyway in the summer. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But I would, if we could take some time to go through Act 72 at some point, I think that's going to be useful. We have a lot of work planned to do that. We're fortunate the federal dollars go out to 2024, but I would predict that that's likely going to have to be extended in order to continue making progress on this, because we're going to run out of time essentially before we run out of money to take care of some of these issues.
One of the things we always help with, I remember, is heating systems. We went to wood chip plants. That's where we helped the schools immensely. And I remember a couple of them being in my district, they were wood chip. They wanted a wood chip facility. We helped finance that, which was beneficial to Vermont and in the future energy. So I guess it's working without the money. That's good to know. Thank you. I'm sorry it took so long. That's good. Thank you.
Yeah, it's working with the federal money. That's essentially the issue. We do have to still figure out the state level funding at some point, but.
Thank you.
Yep.
I'm assuming that you're certainly online with all the people that are asking for some of that federal money, and I'm not sure how we could possibly help trying to extend that deadline for expending it, but certainly I think you would have our support. We've always been in favor of one-time money going towards infrastructure as opposed to an operational system that has to be sustained after that money dries up.
Yeah, I think it's more it's a federal deadline that all states are in a similar position, so we're trying to push that out. But
okay, we're going to talk a little bit about Section 6 in the Capitol bill, and I don't know if you have any props that you want us to bring up on the screen, or what would you like?
No, I can just talk through it. This is emergency construction aid. It's a relatively simple topic, and we're used to coming in annually and sort of refreshing people about this concept, and I'll give you an update on where it's at. If that's all right, I'll just talk through some bullets, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Sure.
So this is, we were just talking Senator Mazza's question about the larger construction aid program. Within that statutory authority, and this is 16 VSA 3448, is this concept of emergency construction aid, and that's further described in a state board rule. But the idea with this program is that we put aside some money, and annually it's been $50,000 appropriation, to support school districts that have, and these are the important terms, unanticipated and unsafe issues emerge that, they have to be unanticipated and they have to be somehow impacting student staff safety. So a true emergency, essentially. So it's important to acknowledge there is some criteria on this. So under this program, when districts have that kind of situation, both unanticipated and unsafe emerge in their facilities, they can apply for emergency construction aid. The emergency construction aid program is capped at the $100,000 of the project, the first 100,000, and it only pays up to 30%. So if you had a project that cost $250,000, the most you'd get from this program is $30,000 because the cap would be $100,000 and it would be 30%. Annual appropriation has been $50,000. Last couple of years, we haven't seen a lot of activity in this program. So when we don't need it, we revert the money back. I want to give you an update this year, what we're seeing, again, somewhat perhaps a function of federal dollars being on the table, but interestingly, this year we do seem to have activity. And I don't know if it's because of the cold, because I think in my history, one of the typical uses of this is when pipes burst. We have 2 emergency applications in right now. I'm expecting a third here shortly. The 2 we do have are going to total up to about 41,000. This is one project's in Charleston for a sewer trap issue, I assume, again, with something with the cold. That project's estimated to be around $14,000. Excuse me. And the Barnett School had a broken water line. That's supposed to be around 27,000. So those 2 together, that gets us to 41,000. But I've been talking quite a bit with the Castleton School District, which is now part of the Slate Valley School District. The Castleton Elementary School had a fairly significant water problem. Pipes froze, I believe, over Martin Luther King weekend. And that resulted in them trying to dry out the school. And coincidentally, the mastic in the sheetrock had asbestos in it. And then they basically spread the asbestos fibers around when they were trying to dry out the school. So they are aware of the program. And this is typically how these things play out when an emergency happens. The superintendent calls and we say, okay, keep us apprised of what you need. And FYI, there's this emergency construction program that's available for you if you need to access it. So at any rate, typical appropriation is $50,000. Some years we've been turning a lot of that back. This year, right now, it looks like we'll have at least 41,000 and probably all the 50 encumbered at some point. Depends on the timing and the approval process. I guess that's pretty much all I had to say about the program. I can get into more specifics about the state board rule and so forth if you have questions, but that's kind of where we're at with it this year.
I'm curious, we recently had a decision to have schools test their water. In the event that a school came back with a registry of really high PFOAs or lead content, would that fall into the emergency category that we're talking about? You've been muted, Dan.
Sorry, not really. Because the regulatory criteria that, again, is in the rule talks about an unanticipated event. So it has to be sort of conforming to that concept. The lead in drinking water isn't really necessarily unanticipated in an emergency standpoint. That's a longstanding policy approach. And the costs there have been fairly nominal. PCBs, on the other hand, that's a great question. Again, to what extent is that unanticipated or not? I mean, that I guess remains to be seen. But that's sort of the challenge between lead versus PCB mitigation. Lead, we know how to mitigate, and we also know it's fairly inexpensive to mitigate. Most often, we're just changing out a faucet. PCBs, on the other hand, we don't have as much experience with mitigation, and we also know it's much more expensive. So if this program were available, it would essentially be, I think, a drop in the bucket relative to what's needed for PCB mitigation.
Okay. Committee questions? I don't see any hands. Mr. Secretary, we appreciate you coming by to join us. I should ask one other question. Have you had this chat already with our House counterparts?
Not on emergency construction aid, no.
Okay, well, I would imagine that when they're done with the capital bill, they get to go first, but when they're done with it, it comes over to us. We look at what they've done and decide how we want to correct whatever they've done. So we might invite you back for some more conversation on the
Yeah.
subject. Senator
Mr. Chairman?
McCormick has a,
Yeah,
yes,
thanks. Just hypothetically, if there were a high school that is just, say, built in the 60s, state-of-the-art modern building once, badly deteriorated, what's available from the state for a community that probably needs to put many millions of dollars into a new high school?
Yes, Senator, that's not an unusual scenario right now. We had, with our school merger law, which is Section 706, was really created in that time period, the 1960s, and it incentivized districts to merge largely to build
High schools.
union high schools. Those districts were formed. High schools are more challenging to operate relative to the scale of the programs and so forth. So it really, that's when we saw a lot of our high schools, union high schools in particular, built. So they're all that same age, and some of them haven't been as well maintained as they probably should have been. So we have this is a big area of deferred maintenance, and I can think of very specific facilities in my head. Namely, I'll use Woodstock as an example of one in your neck of the woods, which I've toured in some detail. They have low pressure steam, heat and crawl spaces that are also on top, where the pipes are on top of their electrical. So these things are really difficult to get down and handle. And they also have sort of a cascading effect. Pipes will burst, break, sewer pipes will break. They're all down in these crawl spaces, really hard to mitigate and repair. And, they're looking at very significant costs in their project. So right now, we don't have construction aid available for them. What districts are starting to do is try to leverage their federal COVID relief dollars to the greatest extent possible. So if there are issues, and the trick with this funding is it has to be related to the COVID emergency. So in particular, issues of indoor air quality are easy to qualify under this funding. But we're also encouraging districts to have the planning and so forth ready to go. I'll say, Fairhaven's a great example of that. This is Slate Valley School District. They had been struggling with, they went through Act 46, formed a single school district. They have small elementary schools that needed a lot of repair. I think of like the Orwell Village School in particular. So they've been ultimately figuring out that it would be useful to build a middle school on the grounds of their high school and try to shut down some of the middle school programs of these smaller schools. So when the pandemic hit, they were close to being essentially shovel ready. They knew what their plans were going to be, and they knew what they wanted to do. Those plans have gone through several different iterations, but they were able to sort of shepherd that project through the qualification under the ESSER programming. So they were able to leverage these COVID funds to the maximum, really to bring that out to the voters at a much reduced cost. Woodstock High School, on the other hand, is an example of a project that is either going to result in the demolition of the existing building and totally new construction, or at least a significant modification of that facility. And right now, we don't necessarily have funds available for that kind of scale of a program. So that's a good example of the challenges we're facing. So we have districts that haven't even done the planning to do this yet, who are really digging out at the deferred maintenance issues. We have districts like Fairhaven, who coincidentally had the planning ready to go, and we have everyone in between there at different phases. So we're trying to, Act 72 kind of pushes everyone forward to start doing the planning. We have issues like the PCB mitigation that'll certainly identify safety priorities. But there's a lot of work here from a policy perspective that needs to occur.
Thanks. Yeah, it's funny you should mention Woodstock. Not to be too cute, that's what I was thinking of.
Yeah, I was being kind of cute myself.
Okay.
I consider myself a connoisseur of school facilities in Vermont, so I've been in most of the buildings.
Well, thank you very much for coming to join us today. I'm sure we'll see you again. Wish you the best of success in the weeks going forward. Hopefully get our schools back to some semblance of normalcy.
Yeah, I'm optimistic. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for coming. Eric, before we shift gears, I just wanted to note that over your right shoulder in the top drawer, you'll find candy. And just for the committee's benefit, I was noticing the clock in our committee room. You might recall we had Mike Chernick on a couple of days ago who insisted that the clock in his office was not really backwards, but I'm looking at that clock and it's right. I'm wondering if Michael was pulling our leg to some extent. Maybe his clock is actually running backwards. Details.
Thank you, Senator. I haven't found lunch yet, so this is going to get me through. So
Okay, oh, and I meant to warn you, that little toy motorcycle in there is, its headlight is loose, so if it pops off, it's not your fault. Happy chewing. We're going to shift gears to Richard Cate, the Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of the University of Vermont. Good afternoon, sir, and welcome to Senate Institutions. I understand you're going to talk about major maintenance at the university. We're hoping that you have all of your labor lined up for that conversation, because it seems we can't find contractors anywhere else in the state right now.
Well, good afternoon, Senator, and all. Yes, it certainly is a challenge. There's no doubt about it. We use our own people to the degree that we can, and we do struggle to get contractors. But for the work that's currently underway, we've maintained the contractors we had. So I guess we're good in that.
That's good. So welcome.
Thank you. If I may, and Alex, I don't know if I have permission to share. I guess I don't right now, but if I can share my screen, I might show a couple of slides.
Yes, I just gave you permission.
Right. Thank you. Is that coming through okay?
It is.
All right. Well, again, thank you for having me. Talk a little bit, and you over the years, most of you have seen some of this information in earlier forms, but I just a little bit of a reminder about what we've got at UVM. We have a lot of old buildings, and just as the secretary was saying, we have some older buildings, and some of ours are even older. I did notice his classroom background that was behind him looked like my elementary school in East Calais from the 50s. So maybe some things haven't changed that much. We've got ranging from 150-year-old buildings to some that are relatively new, but basically they all require some sort of maintenance. I wanted to talk just very briefly about where the funding comes from for the capital improvements and the ongoing deferred maintenance that we have to do. Our inputs vary from year to year depending on if we have a project where we're doing a lot of replacement work versus just our ongoing deferred maintenance. The last few years we've had some capital projects going on. A few years ago we finished up our STEM complex at UVM. More recently, we've been doing some major infrastructure work to the athletic facility buildings and modifying and modernizing some of the existing space there. And so, we're spending $27 million a year. Obviously, the blue piece is the state capital appropriation that we get, and we appreciate that. But obviously it takes a lot more than that to keep our infrastructure going. One other aspect of this, we were asked last year to put forward a one-time capital request for HVAC projects, with a link back to COVID and the need and the desire to improve quality of air in some of these older buildings. So this is a plan which you may or may not have seen, which kind of lays out what we would be doing. As I indicated earlier, some of these buildings go back obviously to the 1800s. Some are, younger than that, but still of an era where our modern day air circulation equipment was not in place. So this is a bit of a breakdown. There's another page to this whereby it all adds up to about $30 million. We have tried throughout the last couple of years to make improvements to the degree that we had funding available, but there is a lot of this kind of work that needs to be done, as well as the normal maintenance and repair for our various buildings. Just a few key points. We've got 5.4 million square feet and about 280 buildings. 64% of our buildings were built before the 70s. And as I said, we've done quite a bit to invest. Our capital appropriation for several years was $2 million. In the more recent years, it's varied from 1.3 to 1.5 million. It's 1.5 million currently. And we have this $30 million one-time request that we put forth. I think all in all, we are doing the best with what we've got. Obviously, this ongoing need to not grow tuition because it is relatively high has been key to keeping us in a situation where we certainly don't have unlimited resources in regard to the work that we do in this area, but I think our team has done a great deal of work with those limited resources, just trying to keep everything going. We are fortunate, when I compare us to all the school districts in the state, we're fortunate we have the concentration of mass where most of our buildings are in one area. We have 5 zones of maintenance that we have teams on, and so each of those teams is very focused and very familiar with the buildings that they're working on. So that gives us an advantage as opposed to bringing someone in cold, here and there to go into a building that they've never seen before. We've got some of our folks that are working in our facilities, they've been there for 30 to 40 years. But then the challenge of that, of course, is that they're getting to the point where they won't be doing this work anymore. And we're looking for younger people to do that. We're actually trying to partner up with the tech centers to groom new people that would come in, and we're creating basically an apprenticeship program because there is such a lack of labor. So we're trying to create our own people. So whereby we bring in people that don't necessarily have the qualifications, but if a couple of years working with some of our folks, they can get up to the level where they can begin careers at UVM. So I think that's really what I've got for you today. Obviously, we appreciate the support from the state, and anything you can do to help us further, we would also greatly appreciate.
Senator Mazza.
Yeah, Richard, good seeing you. One of the things this is probably not a question to Mr. Kate, but one of the things that I've always admired about UVM is the fact that we give them money for major maintenance. If we give them 1.3 or used to be equal to state colleges do not put any money up at all for capital improvements. And UVM, as you see, spends 25 million to our 1.5 million. And that's always been a concern of mine, because I think someone ought to step up the table with some sort of match for that extra money. Plus UVM has not raised their tuition in the last 2 or 3 years that I can recall. So that's always been an issue with me. People think of UVM as a big, rich college, but on the other hand, they step up with a big share of their money alone for the maintenance department and improvements. So that's always been an issue why the state colleges don't do that, and they rely on us 100% for their revenue. And I think that's kind of unfair, because we are dealing with state colleges and UVM also. Thank you.
I don't know, Richard, if you wanted to make a comment on that, you're welcome to.
I won't go into details on the state colleges. I appreciate the senator's support. I think that's my comment on that.
I will only react to say that the difference between UVM and the state colleges is that by statute, the state of Vermont is responsible for paying virtually for everything for the state college system. And that has been the difference between those two entities.
But you have to be responsible for the money you're receiving from the
Oh,
state.
no doubt.
Okay,
no doubt.
thank you.
Sure.
Maybe just one follow-up, Senator, if I could. I think what we have to do, which is different than our peers, not the state colleges, but the other land grant universities around New England and the rest of the country, is that when folks look at our balance sheet, they see a fair amount of debt. We've got about a $580 million mortgage that we're paying on because we don't have the cash to do all the work that we need to do on the campus. And so we're spending about $30 million in debt service in addition to what we're putting into the buildings themselves for the work that we've done over the last decades. In other states, obviously, and they have more resources, and so the state is able to provide more support, or they have much larger endowments or something that help to pay for these things.
I'm curious, we are in the midst of changing our understanding of what has gone on in the past. And part of that has involved buildings and statues that are now looked at much differently than they were when they were initially installed by way of their namesakes' interaction with the populations at that time. Has UVM run into that situation?
We have had a situation, especially with our library, where a couple of years ago we modified the name. It was named after two people, and we took one of the names off because of the circumstance like that. Fortunately, we don't, to our knowledge, have other instances at the moment. We have one building which is interesting. It was built during the Civil War, which has a name that is sometimes associated with someone who it would be a challenge, but it's not actually that person that it's named after. It just happens to be the same last name. So sometimes people are confused by that. But we've made that very clear to our population, and that's been okay at this point.
Well, I was thinking about my old college mentor and a predecessor in the Senate seat that I have now, whose name was Graham Stiles Newell. And Senator Newell made the observation to me one time that if you're ever in a position of naming a building, never name it after somebody who's still alive, because there are a lot of Richard Nixon libraries out there, and some people regret that decision. And of course, what happened to him, he was a professor, now then a teacher at St. Johnsbury Academy, and the Academy named a building after him while he was still alive, and I had to remind him of what he had previously told me. Thankfully, he has not come back to haunt the Academy in any way, shape, or form.
He didn't do anything in the remainder of his life that was going to be problematic for him.
Right. Committee, any other questions?
No, just a shout out to you, Dick. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Senator.
I appreciate your coming by to join us. I imagine we may have you back. The bill that we usually pump out of our committee at the end of the year is still over on the House side. And they always make tweaks to the governor's suggestion. Then we review those tweaks, see what we need to correct. And if you happen to fall into that category of one of the corrections that are necessary, we'll invite you back for another conversation.
Always happy to be with you whenever needed.
We'll try to get you what the state colleges get.
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate it.
Thanks for coming by.
All right, take care now.
See you.
Bye.
Alex, I know that our next witness is due in at 2:00. I don't know if you've seen anybody in the waiting room yet.
Not as of yet. They should be joining us shortly, but yeah, I believe they'll be coming in for 2.
Okay. Committee, I guess we're going to take a 10-minute break. We'll be back at 5 of and pick up the conversation.